intention to lead. And we lead by way of continuous improvement. Now, you know, your governor is correct that require quality teachers, leaders, standards, assessment, flexibility, openness to innovation, and goals, stake in the ground, the notion that we're going to raise that high school graduation rate to 95%, that we're going to be first in class when we look across the nation and we see those native results come out, and that we are going to really invest against that important third grade measure. The governor is absolutely correct on that. It is true that schools have to do better, and we have got to be uncompromising, truculent about that. And usually when you say schools should be held accountable for doing better with the students they have and not necessarily the students they want to have, you see educators getting into the fetal position because they're sure they know what's coming next. But what comes next for me is that schools cannot do it alone. Schools cannot do it alone. The rest of us must help. And let me just stop here and say something. There is now a narrative and a drumbeat in this country about teachers. And we've got to be really careful because we're on the verge of making teaching a terribly unattractive profession. And we will need a new generation of teachers who are better, stronger, more imaginative than the generation we have now. They've got to be better than us if we're going to get where we need to go. So we cannot continue to beat up on teachers. And when we look at Singapore, and when we look at Shanghai, and when we look at those places we hold up international standards, teachers are venerated. In Singapore, teachers are called nation builders. We have to change the narrative around teaching and find ways to lift up, compensate fairly, support teachers. And let me quickly admit, and for the union people in the room, the unions sometimes are their worst enemy. You know, we've got to find a way for unions to care as much about kid issues as they care about the adult issues. You know, we've got to hear them speak about children, not just about the adults. But as annoying as they are, unions are really important. They've played a significant role. There's a future for unions, especially if we care about quality teaching and making sure quality teaching becomes effective teaching. And one of the things that we've got to do is say, as truculently as we said that schools got to work better and got to work for the kids they have, we've got to be equally truculent about our job. The rest of us doing the work. And what has happened a lot in terms of the rest of us doing the work is that there's a kind of a powerlessness, a kind of a helplessness some of us feel about improving education. It's as if there's this fortress there which we can't access. And some of us feel that way even as parents. You know, when we saw Waiting for Superman, how many people saw Waiting for Superman? You know, there was this sense of frustration. There's a sense of urgency, but what do you do? How many people saw Inconvenient Truth? That's about the same number saw Inconvenient Truth. When we left Inconvenient Truth, we went home, we changed the light bulb. We accelerated the recycling. We did all sorts of stuff, and some of us, I volunteer, bought a Prius. All found another hybrid. You know, there was something we could do, and now it may not have added up, you know, but we could do something. That frustration around schools leads us to embrace charter schools for the wrong reason. I'm for charter schools, but I think we embrace them for the wrong reason because it's an alternative to public education. It leads us to hear proposals about blowing up the Department of Education and whatnot. You know, because it's really the mobilization of frustration. What we've got to do is find things that folks can do to help. And what we try to do in this campaign is to say, in the civic space, we have got to solve some problems, and we've got to solve problems that people can get their arms around, to which they can connect, and which they can see as consequential. And there are 3 problems we identified that we thought that people would resonate. 1, too many kids are showing up to school not ready for what school has to offer, and so far behind when they do show up that you can't make enough progress in the 3 years you have. And a lot of those kids are so far behind when they're 3. And that means we've got to start in the home. And we're the first generation, because of these troublesome devices, that can reach virtually every parent with the information and the tools they want and need to give them the knowledge and the skills to do a better job with their kids. We've got to commit to both high touch and high tech. We know that preschool programs work, and we just have to get on with it and make sure kids have preschool programs. You know, it's no longer so much a debate. We know we've got the resource challenges. We've got to get on with it. You know, when we make the easy problems difficult, we make the difficult ones impossible. This is an easy problem. Kids need preschool. Then we've got to figure out how we're going to fix the rest of it. But this readiness problem is a problem that involves health, it's a problem that involves mental health, it's a problem that involves trying to get the health system and the family system to actually combine and talk with the early care and child development system, and then finally with the education system. That's a solvable problem, and folks could get involved in that because people are able to do it through their churches and congregations, through reaching out to families and whatnot. Problem number 2, too many kids missing too many days of school. You know, in some communities, kids are missing 20% of the kids are missing over 10% of the school year. Now, I want you to just, when you do the math, if a kid is missing 10% of kindergarten, 10% of first grade, 10% of second grade, 10% of third, if time on task means anything at all, and it should, and it does, it's virtually impossible to ask schools to get a kid on grade level when that kid has missed 10% of the school year. That's something we could do something about as communities. We can through our congregations, through our own efforts, through our civic engagement efforts, we can get more kids to school, and we can help families solve the problems that keep their kids out of school, including the challenges of health, and a lot of those challenges are about family functions as well. You know, that's a problem that's hidden in plain view because we care about truancy, and we look at unexcused absences, but when we come to early kids, no second graders get up and say, I think I'm going to the mall today. I don't think I'm going to school. Well, we know that's not happening. So the fact that it's 10% absent tells us something about the family. It tells us something about the family. It tells us something about health, access to the health care. It tells us something about the access to child care. It tells us something about family functioning. And we ought to take it seriously as sentinel indicators that there's something wrong and figure out how to fix it. We can do that, and if we do that, we help our schools. And thirdly, for a century we've known that summer activity matters, and summer loss happens, and the summer slide is real. We've known that. And most of us, and I won't ask you to raise your hand, have already figured out what you're going to do. We figured out what we're going to do with our kids already. In fact, some of that we figured that out Labor Day, what we're going to do with those kids next summer. Now, I admit that this is partially about self-defense. I admit that. But the fact of the matter is, what we know is that summer matters. And we go to great lengths to figure out what is the set of summer activities and summer experiences that will keep our own kids engaged, stimulated, and on track. We invest time, energy, and that. And what we know is that for a whole lot of kids with families with little or no resources, that's just not happening, and that's why across the country only 17% of the kids who are eligible for free and reduced lunch get those lunches over the summer. That's why most states send back, go unused. Most of the school lunch money because they can't figure out how to do it. You know, to have kids go hungry because we can't figure out the logistics should be seen as unconscionable. You know, but we do it routinely. So what we know is that if we can solve the readiness problem, the attendance problem, and the summer loss problem, if we can tell teachers that kids are going to be ready when they get there, they will show up every day, and they won't come back in September farther behind than when they left in June, I think we would have gone a long way toward doing what we can in terms of helping schools do better with the kids that they have. When we planned the initiative, we planned for 50 sites. We've got 160 sites now. Because I think this message resonated. I think it resonated to have a stake in the ground, to actually put something on and say, this is our target. I think it resonated because we tried to make the message a common sense one. And when we say kids should be ready for school, people nod. When we say kids should show up at school, people nod more. When we say we shouldn't allow kids to lose ground over the summer, people nod. And they think that there's something they could do about that. But there's something else going on. There's something else going on. You know, across the nation, you're hearing, and you hear it more than anybody else in Iowa. You know, there's this debate about the future. There's this disquiet that all the polls are showing about, that Americans are really concerned. Not just like because we're languishing and in the process not leading, you know, in the number of areas where we could.